Hi everyone, welcome to our daily blog, the last one in our series this year of 2020, and what a year it's been. And as we look to a new year, and thank you so much for joining us over these months as we've looked at so many different aspects of the Christian faith in these short 5-minute videos. Thank you to all those who have contributed towards it. At the moment we've been looking at the story of Jesus' birth and what that might mean and say to us, and particularly we've been looking at John's Gospel this week, and a passage called the prologue, John chapter 1, which speaks both about where Jesus came from, his origins, but also about the message that God placed upon his heart as he came into the world. And I want to take us to John 1 verse 10 today, where it says this: "And he was in the world, and through him the world, even though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him." It's an incredible thing, isn't it? That Jesus was there at the very beginning of creation, the very beginning not only of the world, but of time itself, the whole universe. And yet it says here, the world chose not to recognize him, both 2,000 years ago, but also today. Why is that? You would think the world would want to honour the Son, and yet it chooses not even to recognize him. We'll come back to that in a moment, but I want to take us now to a story a little bit later in John's Gospel, John chapter 6, when just after the feeding of the 5,000, we have this story. When evening came after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus' disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was late, and so it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough, and when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles across the lake, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were very frightened. But Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid, it is I." Then they were willing to take Jesus into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. It's a very short story, isn't it? But it also has this strange idea of walking on water. Was it simply a magic trick? Was that what Jesus was doing? Well, like so often in John's Gospel, it's always trying to point us further on into understanding a much bigger agenda about who Jesus is and what Jesus is trying to say to the world. What is that in this context? Well, to understand that, we need to go back into the Old Testament and understand a little bit about how Jewish people saw water. They weren't a big seafaring nation like, say, the Phoenicians were, so they were quite frightened of water. And indeed, it's a theme that runs throughout the whole Old Testament, but perhaps most famously in the very story in Genesis chapter 1 of creation, where it talks about the Holy Spirit hovering over the waters of chaos, and then God bringing out of that chaos creation itself, bringing land as opposed to sea, bringing a separation between the waters of the heavens, the rains, from the waters of the earth, the oceans. In other words, God would bring purpose and meaning and value to life and give us a direction in amongst all the chaos of all that's going on around us. When Jesus is walking on the water, I'm sure the disciples would have asked, well then, who is this person who is able to command the elements? The only person we know is God himself. So who does that make Jesus? And take that together with the story that we've just talked about, the feeding of the 5,000, and hopefully it might remind us of another story of Moses 1,000 years before, taking the people out of an old creation of slavery in Egypt, through the waters of chaos, out into the desert where they would be fed by God, and from there become a new people for a new land and a new creation. It seems to be a pattern and a way of being that God seems to do again and again and again throughout the Bible, and not least in Jesus himself. And so no wonder the world as it is doesn't really understand Jesus, even though it's been created by him, because the world is often interested in just staying the way it wants to be, when God is always calling us on into who we can become. And what a powerful passage to have as we stand on the threshold of a new year and look to the way forward together. And this can actually be borne out in our lives. not just as an idea, but actually as a reality. One of the books my son has recommended to me over the Christmas is a book by a gentleman called John Elkington called Green Swans. And in it he talks about needing to measure things in new ways, not just about profit and money, but also about the impact on the environment and the planet, and also on other people's lives. And if we can embrace this new way of thinking, then what can happen is we can actually see a bigger picture and a bigger understanding. A Danish company actually did this, and they moved from being one of the biggest fossil fuel consumers of energy into providing the company that provided the biggest amount of green energy in Denmark. It can be done if we can dream in a new way and a bigger dream. Whether that be for an individual or for a company or indeed for all of us, I hope that will be true in this coming year. I wonder what that would be like if we invited Jesus into our boat.